Hi, everybody, and welcome to our Chapter 7 as part of our Design Fundamentals. Today, we are going to discuss a couple of words that you might have heard very often. What we are going to look at is form and negative space. How do you see form in something? And what is negative space? Now, in the design world, these words are going to be used a lot to refer to several things. But before we begin understanding what form and negative space is, we need to define something a little more fundamental. That is, we start with defining our frame. Usually, any artwork, any piece of design, or any creative product is often defined based on the space it occupies. So, defining your frame is always the first step. What is your reference? Is your frame something that is this big? Or is it something that's this big? Is it something that is 3D? What is your frame and how much area are we talking about? That is the first thing you have to define, as well as the boundaries of your frame. After you do that, the next thing you have to think about is the form. How does that work? Let us say you've already defined your frame. Now, the primary central object that you put in the middle of that frame is called your form. Your form can be anything. It can be a picture, it can be any composition, it can be a collection of shapes, it can be any object, but that is the central focus of your object. Now, form is something that is usually the main carrier of your message. If you want to convey something in that frame, then your form basically is the most direct way to communicate. Form is so big and central that it is the first thing that takes attention from the viewer, and it helps the viewer travel their eyes in a certain way according to how it is designed and conveys the message. So, your form is the most prominent thing that you see inside your frame. Now, what is negative space? Negative space is the area that is all around the form, the leftover space. How does negative space work? Basically, your negative space is what holds the form in place. For example, you will not know where the boundaries are of a certain object or what to focus on unless there is negative space. Negative space makes it possible to give breathing space between objects. If things are arranged too tightly together, then it becomes very difficult for your mind and your eyes to decide which way to see things. Should I see that first, or should I see this first? Or should I see this first? So when the eye becomes confused, then the message is lost. Which is why negative space is important, because it allows the artwork to breathe. It gives you leftover space for your artwork to breathe. Now, here comes the creative aspect. Negative space can add a supporting visual to the design. For example, take a look at the yin yang symbol that you can see on the slide here. The yin yang symbol, you will see that there is a black form. There's a black object that is basically a couple of semicircles that are forming that way with a central circle. The remaining space is white. That white space also has a form of its own. Now, because these two are equally balanced, you can't figure out which is the form and which is the negative space. So, that way, there is a double meaning added to this visual, that there is a sense of balance between the black and the white. This is the yin yang symbol. There is a deeper philosophical meaning as a result of this particular balance. Now, your supporting visuals, whenever you create something, can also be used to create optical illusions like this. You can cleverly incorporate hidden messages using your negative space, and that becomes an additional layer of meaning, so that in one go, within a single frame, you are conveying more than one thing, which is your form is the first thing you convey, your negative space is the second layer of meaning. That is, it suddenly becomes more interesting when you see it. Now, how do you use negative space? Now, the first thing you have to think about when you use negative space is hierarchy. Basically, there is a certain way in which you can use your form to make the eye travel. That is, you can decide that first my viewers will see this, then they will see this, then they will see this. That hierarchy is possible only because there is leftover space to support it. Now, that is what is going to make your hierarchy readable and viewable. Somebody who sees it will not feel discomfort, and they'll even feel attracted to see what is in the frame. And they will all 90% of the time read it in the same order. which is top left, middle right, bottom left. Now, if you want to see something in the form of a poster, for example, let's take a look at this Bauhaus poster. Bauhaus is a major school of design in the 20th century, which evolved how modern design is practiced today. And its posters are famous for their simplistic use of colors and forms and text. There is no unnecessary ornamentation. However, using the principles of negative space and form, even the most basic things like the lettering, the arrangement, they themselves become design elements. Now, negative space makes it possible for any piece of text to be readable. If you look at these letters, I can only make out the letters Bauhaus because there is enough space for the form of the letter to be clear. Same goes for the text underneath. Maybe that text is not as important as the title, which is Bauhaus. That is why it has been kept really small. And the major space around, the leftover grey color space, is making it possible for me to be attracted to the lettering, the numbering, the colors, and then followed by the small text. I may or may not choose to read the final text. But all of this is decided because of that hierarchy, which is possible through negative space. Now, you can also try and use negative space to create a new form. All of you must have been very familiar with this illusion, where there are two faces, but because those two faces face each other, they are creating a vase or a vessel in between, which also acts as a form. Now, your negative space creating a new form is an optical play that you can use in most of your work. This is how, when you're creating special visuals, most people try to use negative space and form interchangeably. The tough part is sometimes when you do that, the main point of your message can vanish. That is, should you see the form or should you see the negative space? So that becomes a little confusing. But if you do it right and the purpose is intended well, the results are usually very good. Let's take a look at this example. Here again, we have used form and negative space interchangeably. All of you are familiar with the works of M.C. Escher, and you are also familiar with how tessellations work. This is typically a tessellation which is transitioning from top to bottom, where the form takes the form of two standing penguins that go all the way up, but the negative space creates the form of a falling and dying penguin that is going down. Now, this is a very clever usage of negative space to convey two levels of message. That while you all might find maybe penguins attractive, there are an equal number of penguins that are actually dying. So there is another layer of meaning that is added to this. This play makes it possible to deliver complex messages in a simple visual way. Let's take a look at these logos. If you notice, once again in each of these things, form and negative space have been used interchangeably. If you look at the first word turn, first it's a symmetrical logo. T and U are merged together and it is interchangeable, which is from the top or the bottom, it reads the same way. And every letter is distinguished only because of the narrow gap in between them, where the R is seen as a separate thing, otherwise, those letters would have been read as an M. Now, if you look at the image on the right, it is actually the word illusion. And the letters U and O are only seen because of the use of negative space that way. That the space in between these letters has been manipulated to give the impression that the letters U and O are present when they are actually not. In the other one, you will actually see the letter E that is basically placed in between two plug points like that, which is basically the initial of Ed's Electric, the brand. And now when you go below, Troop's guitars shows two guitars forming the letter T. And on the right, a woman's head and hair is visible in the name, which is hair over here. These are a few examples of how negative space can be used to convey two levels of meaning. That is, the first level of meaning is obviously the form, the second layer of meaning is a specialization. All of these are things that you can do when you use negative space. Now, the question is, how do you use it effectively? In order to do that, you have to try something called inversion. Whenever you draw something, basically, if you say you take a white piece of paper and you draw something in black, whatever you draw in white becomes the negative space. Whatever you see in black becomes your form. But to actually understand whether it is balanced or whether it is giving the effect and impact you need, You can invert the colors. You can invert black and white and their positions and see if the same amount of message or depth is conveyed or if something else can be done. This way, you can be sure that if you're trying to create an optical illusion, is your special effect working out? Now, what you can do is to draw a frame, select any form in black and fill it up. Try and make an inverted version of the same thing. Now, you can ask yourself which looks more impactful, the one in the white or the one in the black? This is the beginning for you to understand how negative space can be used.